Dryden, Pence, and this is the 8th in our series of episodes regarding the coronavirus and the economic response. Today is Wednesday, August the 19th. The last time I did one of these events, we had the client luncheon, which was on June the 27th. And I recommend you go to our website, pencewealthmanagement.com, and look at the client luncheon that we did that day, because I really updated a lot of the information from our previous coronavirus video that was done before. So now I'm going to update you on the virus, the response, the economy, the markets, and the recovery, and walk through a lot of the things that have happened over the last several months. The important thing for us all to know and also all to realize is that summer did not kill the virus. I want to give you some perspective. If you can remember back to March, when everything was getting really kind of scary about what was going on, and we were thinking that we've got a national emergency, we've got all of these things happening. Everybody was saying, let's get a response together because the virus doesn't like summer. And so most of the policy responses, a lot of the medical responses, that whole idea around let's curb the growth, let's stop the growth, lower the curve, all those things were predicated on what was the best science available at the time. And that was this assumption that once we got into the summer months, that the virus would then begin to dissipate. Well, fact of the matter is we're in uncharted territory. And summer did not kill the virus. However, if you can look at this, you can recognize that in the United States, and these are 7-day averages with regard to cases and deaths, a lot of things have happened. This chart kind of walks us through that. You see, originally we were expecting summer would kill the virus. That isn't the case. We've actually had an increase in daily cases. But if you look at this chart, also, it looks like maybe that the United States has finally hit its peak. And most importantly, if you take a look at the red part of this chart, it looks like we've been able to level off on the mortality of this virus. In effect, over time, we've actually learned how to treat things better. Now, I'm going to dig into that just a little bit. So if you take a look at the United States, and you look at average cases and tests, we see that we really ramped up our testing. And, when you had more testing, you had more cases. That's what people were talking about. But now that we've had this situation where we have the average testing has gone up, and now you're actually taking a look at the positivity rate. That's that black line. And you're taking a look at the actual cases. So we've seen some leveling off of cases, although testing's gone up. And we've seen the positivity rate begin to turn down. These are significant positive numbers as we move forward. And I want to break it down and look a little bit at the states. Let's look at the big four: California, Florida, New York, and Texas. Now, if you look at each of those, we all are very familiar with what happened in New York. It was headlines every day. They were affected by it the most at the first, right? And now we're also familiar with California. It looked like that they might be had peaked and come down, and then we found out that they had a huge data problem, that they really weren't reporting a lot of testing that they were doing, and there was some skewing of the data for various reasons, and that prompted the removal of a few politicians. And then when we look at Florida and we look at Texas, again, you're seeing what looks like maybe a peak. And there's also big debates around testing. But I want to just kind of walk us through what's going on. The big thing for us to know is that the fatality rate is going down. We know a lot more about this virus now than we did 200 days ago. We know a lot more about this virus, and because of that case, we're able to see that it's being treated better, right? You can see that as testing and recoveries come down, and we can see that maybe we've hit a peak, we're also doing a better job of caring for people, and the mortality rate is relative to those people who are testing positive or those who have it. We're basically being able to have better therapeutics around this. And that's a very positive inclination, because we're going to talk through all of this stuff. Now, we're about to have a debate over the next 90, 120 days, even longer, about whether or not shutdowns really mattered. Because you see, if we look at the United States and the European Union, we can take a look. For the longest of time, there was this idea about, well, Europe handled it a lot better than we did. Well, they had a little different shutdown schedule, right? But now, as they open back up, you can see they're beginning to see, increase in daily cases. So shutdowns may or may not be a permanent fix to this. The important thing to take a look at, if you look at the United States, that we've been able to look at daily deaths, on average, that's beginning to level off, and daily cases are beginning to fall off. When we take a look at European Union, you can see they had a much bigger spike earlier, that trailed off, and then now as they've opened back up, the good news is while they're getting more cases, their deaths are staying fairly static. This is good news. If you look around each of the countries, you can see how they're all dealing with it as we walk through this thing. Now, the interesting thing to note in all of this data is when we take a look at Sweden. Now, remember, Sweden never shut down. Sweden didn't do that which all of Europe and some of the United States. And this is where I mentioned before, this kind of big debate's coming. You can see Sweden had cases of deaths. And we compare Sweden to Italy because when we take a look, we normalize this for population bases and percentages of population. You can take a look at the mortality versus the cases, and you can recognize Italy, which did shut down quite dramatically, and Europe, the rest of Europe, which did shut down quite dramatically, versus Sweden that didn't. So over the long period of time, over probably the next 6 months, you're going to start hearing a lot of debates as well. Did we do the right thing? Did we not do the right thing? A lot of it's Monday morning quarterbacking. Remember, no one really knew what to do 200 days ago. And everybody kind of did the best they could. So the big question, though, is how long does this affect the U.S. economy? And part of that has to do with how adaptive is the U.S. economy. You see, there's predictions that most of the countries are expected to face recessions in 2020. But you're going to find out that there's certain aspects of the U.S. economy that are not in recession. And that's because of policy response, and that's because of the adaptivity of the U.S. economy and the flexibility we have. Now let's take a look at this, and I want to talk really carefully about some of the things that you might be hearing in the news. Remember, we all knew that second quarter was going to be ugly. And a lot of the headlines were going, oh my goodness, it's a 32% reduction in GDP. Well, what it's important to know is that's taking an event that was created by the government. We shut it down on purpose. We had this big reduction in our GDP for a very, very valid reason, trying to protect our population. But then when the news media reports it, they report it as an annualized number, that we've shrunk our GDP by 32.9%. That's a huge number. It's a whole third of the economy, and they did a seasonally adjusted at an annual rate. But reality was this. If you look at it from the previous quarter, you look at quarterly number. Remember, we shut the economy down basically for a quarter and then began opening it back up. So the data, the real numbers are not a 32% reduction year over year extrapolated through an entire year. It's actually a 9.5% reduction. Still a very significant number. Still a very significant number. But not the 32% that everybody's talking about. So you have to be careful when you see these things on the news to make sure and sort out what is a headline to kind of get a lot of attention from the fundamental facts. And that's one of the things we try to do for you. Like I've always said, we try to be your noise-canceling headphones. So we did have a big reduction in second quarter GDP. Absolutely true. But it was basically from one previous year to the next previous year about a 9.5%. It wasn't a 32% reduction that a lot of the media reported. It's very important to pay attention to the real numbers. So what's happened? We've had 2 bad quarters. I just showed that. We had 2 bad quarters. And then on top of that, we've had tons of U.S. stimulus. So this is this big debate, virus versus stimulus, virus versus stimulus. So what happened? Well, we pretty much shut the economy down for about 48 days. That created that big reduction in the second quarter. And then to fix that, we put a ton of policy response, a ton of U.S. stimulus. And so if you think about it on a daily basis, we had 48 days worth of shutdown and we dumped 80 days worth of stimulus on top of it. So basically from a policy standpoint, we've had more stimulus than we had virus. This is important because that's allowed us to kind of make this not affect us so negatively. And as these debates about further existing stimulus go on over the next several months, right? Because again, we all thought that summer was going to kill the virus. Didn't happen. So now we look at what's phase 2, what's phase 3. But so far, we've had more stimulus than virus. And let me show you, I'm going to walk you through some slides that show you how that's affected us. You see, one thing that happened is savings rates went way up. Okay, people are not spending as much money. So if you don't spend it, you save it. That's also one of the things that's driven the stock market is people have gotten more money. What do? When they save it, they either put it as cash in the bank or what do? They invest it. So that's one of the explanations around some of the stuff driving the stock market that we see that has recovered so dramatically. So savings rates have gone up. But the real question is how quickly do we get traction? Some sectors of the economy have completely recovered or doing very, very well, and others not so much. So it all depends on where you look. It all depends on where you look. It depends on what you're looking at. And these are very important things to pay attention to. You see, what's interesting is if you look at retail sales, look to the very far end of that chart, it's a V recovery. Retail sales have come back quite dramatically. And that's pure evidence of the stimulus. And if you take a look here, the retail sales to pre-pandemic levels, you can look at that again, the same type of situation, a very big V recovery in retail sales. Now that's not true in all sections of the economy. And it's driven by the amount of stimulus that's been poured into it. You see, also, where are we now? But let's look into the future. You see, we have to look at initial claims for weekly unemployment benefits. Now, originally, it spiked way up, and now it's falling very dramatically. But we're also hitting that leveling off period right now. And the most important data for us to look at in the future is how quickly we've got 900,000 people still on unemployment claims, right? Filing initial claims. And so the economy, sectors of it, and areas of it and things like that are beginning to have to sort themselves out as this circumstance becomes more elongated than we thought. These are things we have to watch carefully. So while you see this V-shaped recovery in retail sales that's driven by, as you'll see in a few minutes, some of the stimulus checks, you're still having to look at there's a lot of people that still are unemployed and a lot of people that still have some economic uncertainty that we have to pay attention to. This gives us some reason for a little caution here between now and the final determination of future policy response. So when we take a look at continuing claims and seasonally adjusted, we're also seeing that things are getting better. There's no doubt about it. You can look at the level. Now that black line there is the pre-pandemic level. Okay, and so we've got to take a look at that, and that was, we had record low unemployment, right? And so now we're kind of coming from a record low number, we've spiked up, and now we're coming back. So this is reason to be positive, but it's taking a bit longer. So as some things have had this V-shaped recovery, other things are a little bit longer. So the University of Chicago estimates that 2/3 of the unemployment recipients were making more money on unemployment. Now, you've seen this in the news. I talked about it months ago. And the point is you had a lot of people making more money on unemployment because of that extra $600. Okay, because of that extra $600, you had a lot of people making more money on unemployment than they were when they were working. Now, a lot of folks kind of debated that, but we now have the facts around it, and that's pretty true. And you can look at spending habits. Not only were they making more money, but they were spending it, right? So people, if you look at the statistics, here's what's happened. You had a lot of people who were on unemployment. They were spending more money. Okay, once they got that $600, and a lot of people, they were spending more money when they were on unemployment than they were spending while they were employed. They got the money, they got more money than they were making when they were working, and they spent it. And that's what's happened. So you see this tug of war going on. People that had jobs spent less. People that didn't have jobs spent more. Very interesting behavioral characteristic. And it shows itself in so many different parts of the data. So you can see here that lower income people, their spending did not change so much. Okay, middle income people, they backed off what they were spending. Okay, and the higher income people, they backed off a lot. So it's a little bit counterintuitive as you see things happen. But what this really means is that people in low income brackets that were getting a lot of additional incentive for unemployment, they were spending money, more money than they normally do, right? And then again, they also don't have a lot of savings to rely on. So as you look at this, it sort of makes some sense, but it's very clear that that extra stimulus check that everybody was getting went into immediate consumption. So for most people, however, that extra $600 kind of went away on July the 24th, turned into a big political debate. Now what's happened is, and they haven't solved that point, right? Congress has not solved it. However, President Trump was able to go in and redirect money, right? Saying that this was in effect an environmental crisis. Was able to redirect money, so he's able to put in $300 a week for everybody for a while, and that the states could add another $100 a week. Now, this is ground truth what's going on. Big political debates about it and who's to blame for what and the other. But this, my job here is to be an economist and tell you what's ground truth on money going into the market. So we've in effect gone from a $600 a month extra stimulus that was being spent, as you saw, to now it should be in the neighborhood of $300 to $400, kind of fixing a little bit of that anomaly. Now the problem is that to date only 10 states have received approval for this, right? Others have to apply and they have to be approved for it. But the good news is we were really kind of concerned about this at the end of July. It's still reason for concern, but it looks like here in August, many of the people that were getting $600 a week are now going to get $300 to $400 a week. And there's things there to allow that to happen. So it's a function of the states getting their act together and making the applications. All of this goes to mean that the worry we had about the $600 a week going away has been somewhat ameliorated by President Trump's executive action to kind of put $400 a week in conjunction with the states in as a backstop while Congress tries to work it out. But we're going to have a variable speed recovery, right? How you're recovering, and probably everybody's got friends all over the country, and now that everybody's using Zoom, you're probably communicating with your friends more than you were before because there's not a lot else to do sometimes. So you're able to look at, there's a variable speed recovery. How is it in your state? How is it in your community? What are people doing? And this has kind of moved around, right? We had this moment a couple of months ago where everything was opening, but then maybe it looked like maybe we opened a little too fast in some places and they closed down or they restricted. And all of this goes to show that different parts of the country are treating the virus differently. Different parts of the country are having varying levels of success. How do we reopen? How much do we reopen? And a lot of this, quite frankly, is driven by how much of the population decides to pay close attention to social distancing and wearing a mask. In many cases, it's really kind of that simple. If everybody will just wear a mask, they'll be in much better circumstances. If everybody pays attention to social distancing, they'll be in much better circumstances. And these statistics are beginning to work their way through. But what does it mean for the total economy? Well, we've talked about the variable speed recovery. We've got about half the population is in this environment where we're reopening, recovering, right? And then you have the other half of the population that's maybe pausing or reversing that trend. And so this is how it's breaking out state by state. So this is important because some states were able to open up and they're doing fine and getting back on track, and others are having this fits and starts moment. And that's going to affect how effective we are going forward with a long-term economic recovery. Now, I bring this number up here. This is an important thing to pay attention to. As you know, we look at human behavior. And so one of the things, try to get an idea about these massive changes. So now, although we don't have a vaccine, we don't have a lot of other stuff, but it's, are you tested? Did you get your temperature taken? Do you go before you go into the store or to the mall? Are you wearing a mask? Are you existing in this world of relative inconvenience to kind of get back to your world of doing things? How adaptive is your behavior? So I'm bringing this up because we look at travel, right? It's a big part of the economy, massively affected by this. But so this is TSA travel loadings, right? And we're comparing the red data up there is comparing, this is what it was a year ago, right? March a year ago. And then the darker brown data is what is it today on TSA travel, people going through TSA checkpoints at airports. You see, it's gradually increasing. People are adapting. They're either overcoming their fear, or the airlines are allowing them to have more social distancing on the flights. This adaptability is beginning to come back and to recover. We think that's very important to pay attention to, right? Still, massive difference, but we're now getting back to 700, 800,000 people boarding planes every month, and that's important. But here's where it's important from a behavioral standpoint. If you compare that to this, you see after 9/11, which was a very big moment in everybody's life, this thing that frightened you about traveling, right? Kind of like COVID, made you scared of traveling. And then in response to that, you had to get used to going through the metal detector. You had to get used to the discomfort of standing in lines for a long time. You had to get used to all the things that you had to do to get back on an airplane. Well, much like some of the things that we have to do to get back to living our daily lives, right? It's very inconvenient. It was different. It slowed things down. And so basically, in adapting to the inconvenience of getting on an airplane, it took us about 3 years to get back to similar passenger loadings. Now, this is important because you have to ask yourself the fundamental question, what if there is no vaccine? Everybody's talking about it, right? We thought summer was going to kill the virus. What if there is no vaccine? What if we now have to, for an extended period of time, adapt to wearing masks? How are we going to do that? Testing becomes very key. How long will it be before we can get a very rapid test that you get a result back in just a few minutes, right? Or less, so that you switch from going to a mall, that's a place where you're worried of shopping, or going to a restaurant, that's a place you're worried of being at, or going on an airplane, that's a place you may be worried about being at, till you know that, well, they tested everybody going through the door, so that's the one place that you know that nobody has COVID, right? They've tested everybody going through the door. Just like when you get on an airplane, you know that the only person on that, if there's an air marshal on that plane, he's the only person with a gun, right? When you get into an airport, you know that nobody's walking around with a gun because they've all been screened. This is what we're going to be moving to regardless of what happens, right? We're eventually, hopefully we get a vaccine. We eventually hopefully get better treatments. We see better treatments coming along. We've cut the death rate. But the important thing is, how quickly do we as a society begin to adapt to living with the virus, to coexisting with something that's out there? Because we don't know how quickly we'll get a vaccine, nor do we know how quickly will enough people have taken the vaccine, right, in order to get herd immunity. So this is the point. If you take a comparison to 9/11, similar set of circumstances, it took us about 3 years to get back to normal passenger loadings. So let's contrast that to some of the other things. Now we take a look at total employment. This is important. It has political ramifications, it has societal ramifications, it has income ramifications, it has economic ramifications. And if we take a look at this, we can see so far we had a V-shaped recovery. Remember, I've talked so many times that I talk about what's really important to me as an economist is unemployment is a big number, but the most important number is how many people are employed, right? How many people are making money. So I want to look at this very importantly. So you can see in all employees, total non-farm, we've had this big V-shaped recovery, but we're not yet back to where we were. right? We're still about maybe 6 million jobs short of where we were at the end of the Obama administration and the beginning of the Trump administration. So in order for Donald Trump in the next electoral cycle to say that he's basically a net job creator, we've got 3 or 4 months where we have to add about 6 million more jobs. This is important and it has ramifications, which is why I bring it up. Now the point of the matter is it is possible. It is possible. We've had a couple of months where we had 2 to 4 million people go back to work. So, but this is the one thing we're going to be watching very, very carefully as we look at these projections going forward. It is the total number of employed people, and we have a very sharp V-shaped recovery here. But remember, some states are opening up faster than others, and that's important to look at. Now, moving on. The other side of this is actually some very bright news, right? In spite of everything that's happened, and in spite of all the unemployment that's occurred due to the coronavirus, we're still in a situation that real wages and salaries on the aggregate level are greater now than they were before. Now they've come down, but the real wages and salaries are actually greater. And that's important as we look at our economy. Now I want to take a look at the markets. You'll remember there's 2 things going on. There's this tug of war between the economy and the markets. And the markets have recovered quite significantly, more so than the economy. Remember, the markets tend to look through the economic data. They are a predictor of what's going on into the future, and that's what they're looking at. So when we look at that particular data, you can see that we've really recovered fully from those very frightening moments in March. So the market is completely recovered and come back. So you can see, as I talked about in some of the previous videos, when I was talking about all this volatility in the history that we have, that over the last 5 years, the average days from peak to trough was 24 days. 24 days when it went down. And the average through recovery was about 67 days. Well, in this case, we had a very, very sharp decline. It was about 29 days that we went down quite a bit. And then over about 98 days, a little bit longer on the recovery, right? Much more dramatic on the fall, and then a little bit longer on the recovery. But yet the market still has recovered. And when we look at, as of August 19th, 94% of the S&P 500 companies have reported, right? 33% had an expected earnings decline, but 63% surprised on sales, 84% surprised on earnings. So you see this market recovery, but it's a bifurcated market. Some sectors have done very, very well. Infotech has done very well, consumer discretionary, communications and healthcare, they have done better over time. Whereas the energy sectors and financials and some of the other sectors have done very, very poorly. So we have this bifurcated market. So we have to take a look at the sectors that have done really, really well, or ones that, in effect, COVID helped, right? Because you had a lot of people doing things online and technology and stuff like that. And then you had those that COVID hurt. And so you have to kind of recognize that while the market in and of itself has recovered, some sectors of it have done far better than others. And again, 64% of the companies in the S&P are underperforming the index year to date. You see, this is a very concentrated recovery. It's very important. And this is why when we look at investing, we tend to look at individual stocks rather than just investing the entire index, right? We want to look at companies. So when you look at investing in individual companies and individual stocks in these crazy environments that we have, you're in a much better position to try to figure out which ones are going to do better and which ones are going to do worse. It's not just investing in the entire index. And this kind of bears out as we look at the next number. If you took technology out, right, then the S&P 500 is still down 4% from its peak. See, it's technology companies that have really pulled this all the way through, right? They pulled it all the way through. And that's important, and it makes sense. And you can take a look at the big technology companies, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, all of those. You can see how big they are. And because we employ those technologies to get on with our lives during this travel-constrained environment, this socially distanced environment, this digitally distributed environment. These are the companies that we're using. So what has happened? Their earnings have gone up and their share prices have gone up. And if you take a look and recognize, if you just look at the Apple Store, right, and Amazon, if you took the Apple Store and Amazon and put them together, right, they would be just those two companies would be the 38th largest company in the world. And you take a look at the Apple Store here, it's bigger. Their revenues are bigger than the entire country of Belgium. So some companies have done very well through this, while others have had some big challenge. Again, that's why you look at individual companies. And also, you have to take a look at e-commerce, right? E-commerce has grown dramatically through this. Look at the very far end of the chart. You see, one end was back in 2000 when e-commerce just first started, right? So when you're using 1% and you go to 2%, that's a big increase. But now, when you look at how much e-commerce has grown, when it's a big part of the economy, you can recognize. And here's this slide. Look at the far tail out there. You can see how dramatically e-commerce has increased over the last several months. And this is a trend that we see going on for a long time. If you were not using online shopping before, you certainly are now. And that's the important thing to pay attention to. So this is transformational for our economy in the future. So some of these companies have done well through this, and we think that this trend, because it's a change in behavior, and the fact that we haven't come up with a very quick solution. Summer didn't kill the virus. So people are going to continue to do this social distancing for a while. Online shopping, now people realize how convenient it is. It continues to become now a bigger and bigger part of our daily consumer lives. Let's talk about some dates coming up that are important. The dates coming up that are important are well, you've got an employment data number coming up September 4th. Not a lot between, you're going to have both the Democratic and the Republican platforms published by the end of the month, which kind of tells you what the policy ideas for both parties are, and when people can begin thinking about that. But the real important data point is going to be that September 4th jobs number, because how quickly is the economy and employment recovering? How quickly is all of this going to occur? Because that's going to help tell us how much more stimulus has to go into the economy, how effective any stimulus is. So how quickly are the jobs coming back? September the 4th is going to be important. You know, the cutting of that $600 job stimulus thing from 600 to effectively 4, which is kind of what's happened, is going to give people a lot of reason to want to go back to work, provided that their jobs are there. So that's an important issue, and we need to take a look at that number on September 4th. The big number that probably will create some volatility in the markets is you come up to the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. Will Congress, and it's quite contentious as you know, will Congress get its act together and finalize a governmental budget and authorization? Or are we looking at a government shutdown and all of those things rolling right into a political season? So there's going to be some headline volatility, we think, around that September 30th data. And so pay attention to that in the news, because I think that'll affect things. And then in October, you get another jobs report. That's going to be important. So you have to think if these jobs numbers come in and we really added 2 to 4 million jobs in September and October, that's a very good indication that things are really moving back, and you're getting a much more rapid recovery in that. However, if we see numbers that are significantly below that, that's going to talk about the job market being elongated for a long time, and even greater challenges over time. And then we get into November. November the 3rd is the election, and then November the 6th you have another jobs report. So what? What does all of this mean? How does it affect you? Well, we know a couple of things. We know that if you're over the age of 70, you really need to be very, very careful. We know that those are the people that are most at risk to their health on coronavirus. We know that. We have millions of data points now that we didn't have 220 days ago. We also know that summer did not kill the virus. Summer did not kill the virus. And therefore, we have to begin to fully adapt to this and look at an environment where summer didn't kill it, now we got to live with it. Or figure out how quickly we can get a vaccine or something like that. But even that's going to take a long time. But there's some bright news here. That is, and I've talked about this before, the human condition. You see, there's two comparable or two competing emotions, one of fear, the other of aspiration. And over time, if you look at our history of humanity, aspiration over time defeats fear. If aspiration did not defeat fear over time, we would still be living in caves and be part of the food chain. Obviously, we're not. So what does this mean going forward? A couple of big issues. The first one is we're still in a world of stimulus versus virus. Until we can figure out how to adapt around this, it's how much stimulus can we afford to put into the market to keep the economy going, to take care of those that need it the most, to keep ourselves intact, right? Versus the virus and how much the virus is going to slow things down. And I showed you that forthcoming debate about, well, do we look at life as Sweden or do we look at life as different countries, right? How do we adapt? Do we shut down? Do we stay open? How do we do that? I think what you're going to find is everybody's going to try to figure out how do we continue to have functional economies in an environment where the virus is still around. And then the question is, how effective is a vaccine? And it's not just how effective is the vaccine, but how utilized is the vaccine. Remember, a very large, significant portion of the population says, yeah, great, you get a vaccine, I'm still not going to use it. So that means the virus is probably going to be circulating out there for quite some time. So then the big question is, as human beings, how adaptive are we? Are we going to get used to the idea of, yeah, you got to wear a mask, yeah, you got to socially distance, and that's how we get on with it? And quite frankly, I think human beings are very adaptive. Remember, we had to figure out how to take off our shoes and put them on a conveyor belt. We had to go through a metal detector. We had to decide that flying wasn't going to be so much fun anymore. Yet we continue to do it. So as you think about this debate that's going on, we have to recognize that now for the next 6 or 8 months, we're in this environment where the question is not so much about the virus, not so much even about stimulus, but it's how adaptive are we as human beings to getting on with our lives in this very different environment, and how quickly can we do that? Those are the big questions. And deep down inside, I feel very confident that we're going to probably do all right. And that is going to continue to drive forward. Stimulus is going to be there until the economies come back. As the economies get stronger and we adapt through all this, we're going to be able to look through these problems and find ourselves in a much better set of circumstances. So I've covered today the virus, the response, the economy, the markets, and the recovery. Well, we've talked about the virus. We've talked about our response. That's a policy-driven response, and we kind of know what we need to do. We just have to get on with doing it. The economy is beginning to come back. As you've seen sectors of the economy in different regions of the country, those things are opening up. The question is, how long does it take the rest of us? The markets have pretty much already looked through this with the same level of confidence and said, all right, we're at some point, we're going to get back to where we are, and that's what they're pricing in. And then the question is the rest of the recovery. Time is the big question. But one thing that we know is that over time, the human race adapts. We are the most adaptive species on the planet. And because of that, we're going to adapt our behavior and continue to consume and continue to be what we are. And that's going to be very good for the long-term prognosis of both the markets and the economies. So I hope that this gives you some perspective. There's still a lot more to come. I hope you find this helpful. Thank you very much, and be safe.